Ireland is spending currently, it is spending less than 0.3% on defense. Now the NATO minimal target, 2%.
Yeah.
And Poland now is getting close to 5%. So Poland is spending, about 25 times as much as a percentage of GDP. So the Irish government is publicly saying, well, we're going to improve and we will increase spending. In reality, because it is surrounded by NATO and because it does get security for free, there's a lot of public resistance to increasing spending.
Welcome to podcast Hubungan Internasional. This podcast is brought to you by the Department of International Relations, Universitas Gadjah Mada.
Hi friends, welcome to podcast Hubungan Internasional. My name is Muhadi Sugiono. With me today is Tobias Thieler from the University College Dublin. Hello Tobias.
Hi Muhadi, great to be here.
Yes, nice to see you here. So Tobias, could you tell us a little bit about your interest, your research interest, your focus?
Sure. So I'm a lecturer in the School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin. And my focus is international politics with a somewhat of an emphasis on European integration, European politics as well. And theoretically, I'm interested in theories of integration, but also a little bit more broadly, political psychology and political sociology, and how that applies to Europe as well.
Okay. Tobias, it's great to know that you are interested in European politics and European integration, and it is also my concern as well in this department. And it is quite interesting for me to know that Ireland was admitted as a member of the European Union in 1973, correct?
Correct.
Along with the UK.
Yep.
And now UK has left and Ireland stay there. Can I ask you, how satisfied is the Irish people with the membership of Ireland to the European Union?
Generally, so support for the European Union is very, very high in Ireland compared to Britain. The relationship was much, much friendlier from the very beginning. Like Britain, as you know, has had a problematic relationship with the European Union, really almost from day one. And in Ireland, it was much, much less problematic. And there were several factors involved in that. One was economic. Ireland initially, when Ireland joined the European Union, it was still a poor, by European standards, a poor country. I remember the Economist had a title page about Ireland, and the title was the richest of the poor. No, sorry, the poorest of the rich. The poorest of the rich. So, and of course, Ireland received a lot of funding from the European Union, a lot of structural funding during the first 20, 30 years of membership.
So, from the economic point of view, Ireland has been very beneficial as part of the European Union.
Absolutely, yeah. There was a huge economic benefit.
But the other aspect is the European Union has a goal of ever closer union. And this is one issue which UK has made it a big deal and which led the UK to leave the European Union. Is it not the case with Ireland?
It is to some extent the case with Ireland. So in Ireland, if you think back to about 20 years ago, there were two referendums relatively closely spaced to each other. One was the Nice referendum and the other on the Lisbon Treaty. And both were initially rejected. And then the Irish voted again. And then they were accepted. And part of the independence issue was an issue, particularly neutrality, also independence in terms of lawmaking, independence in terms of EU legislation. But it was much, much less of an issue in Ireland than it was in the UK, which reflects Irish history. You know, Ireland was a colony for a long period in history. It was, of course, Britain was the colonizer. So Britain, and if you're a colonizer, you are more sensitive to the issue to the perception of being potentially dominated than if you have been dominated throughout most of your history.
Yeah, we will come back to your neutrality of Ireland. Now, I would like to ask you a bit further about the referendums that took place in Ireland with regard to Nice Treaty as well as Lisbon Treaty. Because if Ireland rejected the treaty, then the treaty will not apply in the European Union. And how can the first referendum fail to give support to the European Union treaty, but the second has been very successful. Is there any change?
Yes, what happened, so after the initial rejection, the Irish government then renegotiated, and they got certain clauses in those treaties which affirmed Irish neutrality. And then now in practice, they didn't actually mean that much, but it was enough for the Irish government to say, look, we renegotiated it, now you can vote again. Because they couldn't have made people to vote again on the exact same treaty, right? It's democracies. And then, of course, and there was also a lot of pressure. The Irish government said, look, we are a country of 5 million people. This is a bloc of almost 500 million people. We just cannot, they're not going to look well upon us if we just keep blocking this. But I mean, to be honest, Ireland is one of the few countries where there have to be regular votes. So every time you amend an EU treaty, you have to vote in Ireland because it has constitutional implications. If other countries had voted, they too would probably have rejected it. So Ireland was not an outlier here. It's just that in Ireland, you have to vote on those issues, whereas in many other countries, you don't. And remember, France rejected, the European Constitution treaty. So,
but that was European Constitution, not the treaty.
Yeah, well, it was called European Constitution Treaty. It was kind of a verbal acrobat.
Yeah, probably the name of Constitution make it a problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, Constitution made it more. But the point is that there's a lot of Euroscepticism in many European countries, and Ireland, I think, is probably the one where you have, relatively speaking, less Euroscepticism than in other member states. I think another factor was, of course, because Britain was so Eurosceptic.
Yeah,
that meant that Ireland tends to like to position itself different, a bit like
not only different but opposite.
Yeah, it's a bit like the parent-child relationship. The colonizer-colonized relationship. So if Britain says no, Ireland likes to say yes. It's just at least at the popular level, that's its sentiment.
Yeah, let's go back to the status of neutrality of Ireland. It is quite interesting because while Irish people are among the least skeptical with the European Union, as I mentioned before, Ireland has very different position from the European Union or the majority of the European Union member countries. At least I find it in three different ways. First is about the Ireland as a neutral country, along with Austria, Malta, and formerly Sweden and Finland, but no longer with Sweden and Finland as they join NATO. And the second one is Ireland has been very critical on the case of Gaza against Israel. Yeah. And the third one is Ireland is very consistent in supporting nuclear disarmament. Ireland, along with Austria and Malta, also part of the TPNW. Now, if we look at this current development in the European Union, where the European Union is getting more and more geopolitical, how can Ireland maintain its position of neutrality?
That was one of the core issues that always underlies, every time the EU tries to involve itself more in foreign policy and defense, that's an issue that arises in Ireland. And this is part of the treaty amendments that Ireland obtained after the referendums that we talked about earlier. I mean, in general, so the EU has what it calls a common foreign and security policy, but it's really, for the most part, foreign policy and defense are still national domains. And so it is not an issue that really directly applies. So generally the position is, EU heads of state and heads of government negotiate. If they agree on a common position, that's the EU position. If they don't agree, then they don't have a common position. Or they have certain opt-outs. For example, Hungary regularly abstains from supporting an EU resolution, but then it can go through anyways. The problem with Irish neutrality is that, of course, the geostrategic environment has changed and has changed really, really dramatically. Ireland is less affected by those changes than many other EU countries because it's far away physically from Ukraine and of course from Russia as well. So Ireland, in a sense, Ireland can take a step back. Also, Ireland is surrounded by NATO countries, NATO West, NATO North, NATO South, NATO East. And that means that Ireland really, in a sense, can free ride with its security. Ireland has
that is what I would like to ask. Does it make Ireland look like a free rider?
It does.
In European politics?
It does, and other countries are sensitive to that, and the Irish have woken up. So Ireland is spending less than 0.3% on defense. Now, the NATO minimal target is 0.2. The NATO minimal target is 2%.
Yeah.
And Poland now is getting close to 5%. So Poland is spending, about 25 times as much as a percentage of GDP. Now, the Irish government is publicly saying, well, we're going to improve and we will increase spending. In reality, because it is surrounded by NATO and because it does get security for free, there's a lot of public resistance to increasing spending, because there are a lot of other priorities, there's health and housing and education and all the rest. So the Irish government is at the moment, it is walking a very delicate tightrope. So on the one hand, it needs to signal to the other European states, look, we are improving, we are spending more. On the other hand, it cannot be too overtly about that. And of course, the other issue is that there are issues, particularly one huge issue at the moment are the cables that go through Irish territorial waters, which Russia is accused of cutting and monitoring and sabotaging. There's also Irish airspace. There occasionally, Russia is basically playing games in the Irish airspace to the west. And Ireland cannot police its own territorial waters, and it cannot police its airspace. It doesn't have an air force to speak of. So it relies on French and British forces largely to defend it now. There's a kind of degree of post-colonial pride that is sometimes, every time Ireland has to call the Royal Air Force to police Irish airspace, it says, well, why? Didn't we leave? Didn't we 100 years ago? Didn't we have a struggle to get rid of our colonial masters, and now we have to rely on them? However, the problem is that Ireland is lagging so far behind in terms of military spending that it would have to invest a huge amount just to get to the 2%.
Yeah.
That this is very unpopular, and no political party is going to put this in its manifesto. We are going to increase defense spending.
Do you think that the other European member country will push Ireland to increase military spending?
Yes, they will, and they will do so publicly to an extent, and even more so behind the scenes. They are pushing Ireland to increase military spending, and they have a good case. Ireland is now, by some estimates, it's the richest country in Europe, right, on a per capita basis, and it has the lowest defense expenditure on a per capita basis of all European countries. There's a real clash here, right? You can't be the richest country and have the lowest defense expenditure. So there is more emphasis now on pushing Ireland. But at the moment, a lot of it is still behind the scenes. But I think you will see if Ireland resists, that will become more public. Of course, the question is, well, what are they going to do? If Ireland just says, if the Irish government just drags its feet and it says, well, maybe next year, so on, then eventually there's nothing really they can do.
But that was not the case, because in the past also the European Union has also experienced the same thing, because the European Union focused itself on the economic development, while the military spending was from the US.
Yes, of course, of course. Yeah, the European Union is a non-military. It is in its very nature, it's a non-military. It is a pacifist project, right, initially. I mean, that was the aim of the European Union, was to prevent ever another war in Europe or among its members occurring. And it has been spectacularly successful in doing that.
Okay, let's move to areas beyond Europe, because for many years European Union has been focusing itself in the European territory. Okay, and since I think 2016, the European Union began to project itself as a global player through the adoption of the EU global strategy. How does Ireland position in this case in the changing configuration of power, with the rise of China, with the EU identifies as a systemic rival, competitor, but at the same time also partner? Quite interesting characterization. Or the growing assertiveness of the global South. And the fact that Ireland does not always sit very nicely with the position of the European Union.
A lot of it has to do with history. So Ireland is a European country, a Western country, an English-speaking country, but it's also a former colony. And it's also a former, colony that went through brutal times. We sometimes forget, less than 200 years ago, 1 million Irish people were starving. There was the Great Famine. And that created, I think, in the Irish psyche, an intuitive sympathy for the underdog, people who are being oppressed, people who are, to some extent, equated with the Irish situation. Now, you can debate whether or not, the situation of the Palestinians is really that similar to the Irish situation 200 years ago, but it has created in the population an intuitive liking for the underdog and also an intuitive dislike of injustice. I think the Irish people are very, very sensitive to seeing people's rights being violated, and I think you can see that in the support for the Palestinians, which goes back a very long time. That's not just a recent thing. That's gone back to. So Ireland has always been more sympathetic than the average EU line. It has also generally been more sympathetic towards the global South. I think it has had a general understanding of what it means to be oppressed, of what it means to be on the receiving side of oppression, and it has to some extent infused that into its foreign policy. Now, cynics might say that a lot of this is rhetoric. When push comes to shove, Ireland then tends to side with the Americans, and it does tend to side with the powerful European countries. So a lot of that is rhetoric, but there is also a deeply felt, I think, psychological attachment to the oppressed and to injustice.
Well, one of the most interesting thing with the European Union is its promotion of European values. But it is this European values which has been under attack. To defense, the US Vice President in his address during the Munich Security Conference said that the worrying threat to security of Europe is not from Russia, not from China or from external actor, but the threat from within. And I quote, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America. He made this remark with reference to the response of the EU to the rise of the far-right parties. So my question is, how does the rise of far-right parties affect the politics in Ireland?
Ireland is an interesting case because Ireland is it's the only country or one of the very few EU member states that does not have a far-right party in Parliament at the moment. Now, it does have a party that's called Independent Ireland, which is a new party, and they are flirting with populism, and they are generally sort of immigration skeptic, but they are not really a far-right party in the European sense. So Ireland in that sense is different from the rest of Europe. That said, there is hostility towards immigration in Ireland has increased significantly over the past few years. And that has to do with two factors. One, that immigration has increased significantly. So the Irish population on average is growing 10 times faster than the European average. It's a very, very rapidly growing population. So it's grown from 3.5 million within a few years to 5.3 billion at the moment, 5.4. So it's gone really, really rapidly. And there is a significant housing crisis. Ireland is currently facing a really dramatic housing shortage. And we know what drives the far right. It's need, right? It is scarcity and it's envy, seeing newcomers arriving. And there are a lot of myths that are not true. So the idea that, refugees get free housing immediately, which they don't. So, but there are a lot of myths that the extreme right is thriving on. They are very active on Twitter as well, or on X as it's called now. So they pull all the stops they've pulled in other European countries. In terms of how to react to the far right, many of my colleagues very much disagree with me, but I think J.D. Vance had a slight point, I think. So there has been a tendency in trying to fight the far right by essentially through legal measures, by outlawing it, through censorship online, and that just doesn't work. Like, we know that doesn't work. If you try to censor, because that only plays into the hands of the far right, because the far right can say, look, they're trying to, they make a martyr out of us. The way you confront the far right is with free speech, right? It's with facts, it's with, and I think J.D. Vance was actually correct to some extent, right? Now you can question, well, that's kind of ironic that it comes from his own administration, which is not exactly promoting free speech. But back in the US, that's all true, right? I share all that. That's absolutely true. I share all the criticisms. In Ireland, so far, the far right has not been a major problem, but I am worried. And I am worried, especially, it is really the Irish housing crisis, which is a byproduct of the economic success. Now, immigration is a byproduct of economic success, and it's a driver of economic success. Ireland needs immigrants to work on those multinational companies that have come to Ireland. But the housing crisis is really, really serious. It's the most serious housing crisis in Europe, probably the most serious housing crisis anywhere in the world. So every month now there are, a few hundred free apartments in all of Ireland. It's a massive shortage, and that drives, we know that that's what drives the far right. It drove the Nazi party all the way back, the economic crisis. And this is really something, if you want to fight the far right, you need to address the underlying material issues. And I think the Irish government is now waking up to it. They're now waking up to the fact that they really need to push housing, and they need to do this with a laser focus, really, really driven. And linked to that, we have some of the same problems that, some of the other European countries have. So there's a predominantly indigenous underclass and it's largely white men, right? White working class men who are to some extent not benefiting from the economic success as much as some others, and they become resentful, and so they all those issues in terms of low educational attainments, especially among men, which seems to be a kind of Western but particularly English-speaking world problem, that white working class men are left behind.
Your explanation seems to suggest that there are material basis for the rise of the far right, isn't it? But what about the ideological basis of the far right? Because when we are talking about ideological basis, we talk about the network that they have, the influence from one another. So you cannot see the rise of far right, even in Ireland, as a separate and isolated development.
Yeah, that is very, very true. And there's been a lot of influence from America as well. The sort of MAGA movement has kind of internationalized to some extent, and they're using the same, themes, the same strategies as well. That is very true. At the same time, I think, there are issues that are specific to Europe, right? So part of it is the fact that traditional social democratic parties, which attracted the working class vote, they have, first of all, they have collapsed in terms of vote. And then they have turned to what we call cultural issues, things like gay rights, transgender rights, which are important issues. Like, I don't in any way dismiss those issues, that are really important civil rights issues, but they don't affect the vast majority of their core constituents. So they need to refocus on, I think, economic distribution and economic opportunities, which a lot of left-wing parties stopped doing. I think that is one factor. The other factor is that traditional mainstream parties have become more and more similar. And what happened is that the mainstream left largely adopted the neoliberal agenda of the right, and the right adopted the social agenda of the left, right? So the right is also pro-gay rights now and pro-women's rights, and the left is largely pro-privatization, which meant that essentially you have the same party with two different names, right? With three different names. And that then, of course, leads people, if you're a dissatisfied working class white male, you're looking elsewhere. Right, for somebody who talks to your problems, and those far right parties often offer that alternative. Linked to that also, that there has in some European countries, and Ireland is one of them, problems linked to immigration where traditionally that there was a taboo around them because parties didn't want racist discourse. And again, that was a very laudable aim, but the problem is if you don't talk about immigration, the far right will talk about it. Right? So essentially you give them a monopoly to frame the issue. And what they should have done a long time ago is really to talk about immigration like any other policy. It's like any other policy. It's a good thing, but there are problems linked to it. You need to talk about those problems. You need to talk about integrating immigrants as well, especially immigrants from cultures that are often in a way like that are removed from European values in certain respects. So how do you integrate them? You need to promote language learning. And you need to prevent the formation of ghettos, which in some European countries have started to form. And I think the left or the mainstream political spectrum made a mistake by not articulating those problems early enough, and that then led to the far right essentially taking over that share of the political market.
Well, that is quite interesting and very timely discussion about this issue. And I'm afraid that the issue will not go away in the very near future. Okay, as far as I know that you have been to Indonesia twice, but the first visit was as a tourist. And now you have the chance to visit and stay and talk with so many people in the universities. What is your impression of Indonesia? And do you think that there will be any possibility to improve academic exchange or improve the relationship between Ireland and Indonesia?
I hope so. So Ireland, I mean, for a long time, Ireland didn't even have an embassy in Indonesia. And their entire Asia strategy was really focused on China. And that has changed, I think. And Indonesia is now valued more, because it's a democracy. It's the world's largest Muslim country. It's so-called moderate, what we call a moderate Muslim country, right? So it's important in all kinds of ways. And I hope that, there's definitely room to improve exchanges, collaboration. I hope so. Indonesia, for a strain, I think it's in part also because Indonesia never really was seen to be a problem country, right? So it's a little bit like students, right?
Yeah.
You spend the most time with students who are problem students, who plagiarize or who fail their exams, right? And you don't spend enough time with students who are, good students who do. I think with Indonesia, because Indonesia was never really, quote unquote, a problem country, right? Everything. So that, I think, meant that Indonesia was a little bit off the radar in Europe. But I think that is changing, and I certainly hope it's changing, because it's really, it's obviously necessary. It's 300 million people. It's a really, really important country. It's a democracy. It's a multicultural. In many ways, Indonesia is what the EU wants to become, right? A multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious society, geographically spread. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of room for collaboration.
Do you realize that this year is marking 70 years of the Bandung Conference?
Yes.
And I think so the spirit of emancipation and liberation is shared between Indonesia and Ireland.
And next week, I plan to go to Bandung and to look at, there's a museum where the Bandung Conference was. And this is firmly on my agenda to visit the Bandung Conference.
Okay, it has been great to talk to you, Tobias.
It's been great to talk to you
again. See you.
Thank you very much for having me.